Then we have Generation Z, born from 2001 to 2020. And because of that, we don't yet have a complete picture of them as employees. But so far, we can see that their lives revolve around technology in a manner that no other generations has. To them, technology is second nature. It's like me using a pen. And they are always open to new technology. In fact, they look forward to it. There are going to be a plethora of studies in sociology and every other discipline you can imagine about how this has affected Generation Z in every way you can imagine. We already know that they really value their independence instead of teamwork, which is a key difference with earlier generations. They really value their individuality, and they like to work on multiple things at once. For this generation, multitasking is second nature. Whether it's multitasking with something on technology or mentally or physically doing something. Whether this is because of growing up with technology or something else, this generation already has a reputation for having difficulties staying focused on one thing, for needing more mental stimulation than previous generations, which is absolutely going to affect their work. And you know, when you step back and think of the differences in the role of work for employees from generation to generation, it seems to be very small and subtle differences. But when you step back yet again and look at differences between multiple generations, then you can really see trends emerge. So the silent generation were all about being dependable workers, having stable employment no matter what the employment was, and no matter whether you like it or not. And they emphasized being obedient and not questioning authority. Contrast that with baby boomers who considered it completely acceptable to question everything, or millennials who consider personal growth and work something that's important. Both Generation Z and millennials consider technology something that's positive. And the distance that technology creates between people is considered completely normal and acceptable. Whereas for baby boomers and traditionalists, and yes, Generation X, communication has always been more personal. Generation X has been very, very clear that they're not willing for their lives to be dominated by work, that there's always more to life than work. Whereas baby boomers were generally what we would call workaholics. So there are distinct generational work differences in regards to what employees expect from their work and their workplace, regarding what role they feel they have as an employee, in terms of how work fits into their life as they age, and how work fit into their life when they were younger. These differences that seem subtle but seem not to be too significant, in fact, affect a person as they age. These differences interact with the aging process and affect the aging process. So the different societal forces and work trends encountered by each generation also shape the aging process. The experience of aging here and in other parts of the world, it's even more noticeable. In those parts of the world, differences between generation in terms of their work have even more direct effects. And I'll give you a couple examples. In Lebanon, for example, they have the fastest growing older adult population in the Arab region. Little to no social safety net in place for the older population. They have relatively low fertility rates and a high rate of out-migration for young workers. All of these issues are problematic in their own way. So Lebanese culture entails very strong family values, and the older population is heavily reliant on adult children in later life. Almost 80% of older men and women in Lebanon live with family members. So multi-generational households are the absolute norm. It is distinctly frowned upon to place a parent or grandparent in a nursing home. And because of this, there is no large-scale assisted living structure in place. Spaces that are available in any kind of assisted living facility for older people in Lebanon are very, very limited. So on one hand, having multi-generational households as the norm is positive, since about 80% of Lebanese people 65 and older have no retirement benefits, no health care coverage, no pension, and the country does not have a universal social security system. There is no universal benefit for older people like Canada's pension plan or old age security. Now, in Lebanon, while a person is working, there's the Lebanese National Social Security Fund, but you have to be employed in the public sector. And when you retire, this ends. So you only have access to this while working. You have to have been an employee with a taxable wage to benefit from this while working. And when you retire, when you most likely need these health benefits the most, they end. Only a small part of the population, mainly those who worked in the military or security forces, can rely on pensions and health benefits after they retire. When somebody's employed in the private sector, they're provided what we would call like a lump sum one-time payment when they retire, not a pension. And that amount is based on the last month or last year of work, whichever one is higher. Since about only 22% of Lebanese women participate in paid labor, non-working married women rely on their husband's benefits. But again, for most, these are only available to people still working, so when their husband retires, this ends. If their husband does receive a pension of some kind, should he die first, the pension is cut off. And women usually live longer than men. So again, older Lebanese adults in general, and especially older Lebanese women in particular, receive the majority of their income from their children in later life. And if their children do not provide for them, they have to rely on charity. So it's the cultural norm for family to be the main provider of care for older people, both financially and socially, in regards to health care. But Lebanon has a relatively low birth rate. And a lower birth rate means there are fewer and fewer children and grandchildren to care for older people, to share the responsibility for caring for older family members, financially and otherwise. And in addition, in regards to employment, there is a high rate of out-migration for young people in Lebanon. This means people leaving the country to work elsewhere. So they're not just moving to another part of the country, moving to a different city, they're leaving the country altogether. Those young adults who leave are usually better educated and leave Lebanon to take on a better paying job elsewhere, which is positive, because this means they're in a position to send at least some money home. But on the negative side, the amount of money they're able to send to aging relatives varies, and this means older Lebanese adults having fewer children and grandchildren to care for them in old age, with them to assist them on a daily basis. So the pressure on adult children to provide in every way for aging relatives means many struggle. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to be the sole financial provider and to be responsible for the social needs and healthcare needs of your older relatives. We've seen this in China as well because of China's previous one-child policy. So because the population of China was becoming in every way possible unmanageable, the government instituted a one-child policy, meaning a couple was only legally allowed to have one child. If they had more than one, they would be fined really, really, really heavily. In China, in addition, male sons, way to go, Jennifer. In China, sons are expected to look after their parents when their parents get older. So this also led to a further problem in China of a huge gender disparity. They had millions more young men than young women. So in China, you have this spoiled little boy down at the bottom here who had to care for his parents, but also, in addition, care for any grandparents that were still living. So China faced the same kind of difficulty. And in addition, during times of instability, such as during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the global economy took a nosedive, it became even more of a struggle. Now, one solution that some Lebanese have is to employ immigrant women from low-income countries like Sri Lanka or the Philippines or Ethiopia, and use these as domestic living caregivers to provide the care that used to be provided by immediate family members. But of course, that's only an option for people who can afford it. If we take a look at India, in 2019, over 139 million people living there were over age 60. So about 10% of the country's entire population is over age 60. That is expected to double by 2050, which is a huge demographic event. In regards to financial support and pensions, India is an interesting case because it's a country with a high rate of illiteracy and a very high poverty rate. It's still undergoing the process of industrialization and urbanization, and it's still within the process of adapting to technological change. So in some ways, India remains a very underdeveloped third world country that means very traditional collectivistic values, while in others, or depending exactly where you are in the country, it doesn't. And as a result, overall, there's been a distinct weakening of intergenerational ties that have always been the absolute norm of the entire population. And there's a mix of what seems to be progress in regards to older persons and work and the pensions and benefits and all of that, at the same time as there's really an adherence to an older way of doing things. Now, in 2007, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment in India actually passed something called the Maintenance of Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act to provide more support and maintenance of senior citizens. And what this does is makes it a legal obligation for children and heirs to provide maintenance to senior citizens and parents in terms of a monthly allowance, and it helps to protect the property of older persons. However, this is not strictly enforced. There are state pensions, what we would call a provincial pension as well, but only about 17.4% of senior citizens receive money through this legislation, which means about 70% have no pension at all. There is the Indira Gandhi National Old Age Pension Scheme, which provides people 60 to 70 with about 200 rupees a month, but the recipients must be within a household that's below the poverty line, and elderly women who are without savings and unable to work find difficulty in obtaining a state pension. And India has a reputation for being somewhat of a bureaucratic nightmare, with laws and regulations often not enforced at all, and this demonstrates that very well. So to kind of summarize the pension benefit issue for India, some steps have been made to create means-tested basic living supplements, but they're not widely used or implemented. In India, it is also a cultural norm to live within a multi-generational household, keeping older generations with you, whether in a rural or an urban area. And it's not unusual to include unmarried or widowed older relatives as well. So, cousins, aunts, uncles. Unlike Lebanon, in India, they have a much higher birth rate, so a shortage of younger family members is not usually an issue. But this has created a different kind of problem, a youth bulge, which means that their population has a very, very high percentage of young people. In 2020, India's average age was just 29 years, in comparison with 37 in China and the United States. So if you follow these two links, they're just short little YouTube clips about the difficulties faced by older citizens in India when they don't have family to rely on either socially or financially. So as I said, as you can see here, India's youth bulge is really significant. On one hand, this is positive for older people because it means they have many family members right there to assist them. But it's also really negative because it's so difficult for older people to have any kind of employment if they want it or need it. At the moment, India needs to create about 10 million jobs a year in order to keep up with this youth bulge, which it is absolutely not doing. And this has accurately been referred to as a demographic time bomb because the potential negative effect on the economy to have so many young people with no means to support themselves or their families is going to be disastrous. There are simply not enough jobs, leading to a very high employment rate in a country where caring for older people yourself is the norm. In addition, more and more of the younger generation are not satisfied in the same way their parents were to eke out a living in a rural area. So there is a transition, or at least a hint of a transition, from an agrarian economy to something else, but India doesn't have a solid manufacturing-based economy in place either. So overall then, it's a country in flux which directly affects employment, which directly affects older people and their place in society, and how they are or are not cared for. So there are distinct generational work differences, specifically in regards to work, caused in part by social influences. These vary depending on which country and culture we are looking at, and they directly affect how people work, the effect work has on them, how they age, what their senior years are likely to be like, and the resources they have available to them in retirement. The different societal forces and work trends encountered by each generation also affects the aging process. The experience of aging here and in other parts of the world, it's even more noticeable. And in Canada, we like to complain about how our pension system needs to be overhauled, about how long wait times are for certain kinds of health care or when we have to go to the emergency room. We talk about there being a need to increase funding for older people, etc. And yes, absolutely, there are improvements to be made in all of these programs, especially once you get to the point in your life when you need to interact with the services and programs for seniors, whether for yourself or for your parents. You quickly realize there are gaps in how all of these things function. At the same time, what would your life be like if you knew that when you got older, your parents had to live with you? And I'm not just throwing that out there. I want you to really think about it. As somebody in their teens or 20s, what would your life be like now? How would your plans for your life change if you knew that eventually your parents were going to live with you? So in this course, we'll be looking at various issues that affect age, health, and work combined. And as such, I think the natural starting point most people would think of is middle age and older, but that's really not accurate. Very simply, what comes before affects what comes after. And this holds true for a person's health and for a person's work, and then for both of those in relation to each other. So the course is going to begin by taking a life course perspective, and this means that we'll consider how our work in our earlier years affects our health and work in later years and how we age as adults. Yes, this might even mean going back to the jobs that you have as teenagers and how that affects you. I know with some topics, it kind of seems like, why are you doing that? Why are you going back and starting at the beginning? But when it comes to work and health, you'll see that this really is important because of the potential effect. Then we'll get more focused and really consider how a person's health and well-being are affected by their work, not just for those who work in physically demanding jobs. We'll look at issues aging workers are more likely to have, whether that is how employers view them and treat them, discrimination in the workplace because of their age, or things that are simply more important to them in regards to their work because of their age. Then there is retirement. As somebody in middle age who is looking forward to retirement, it's like talking about winning the lottery in some ways. But retirement is not just this simple transition from being a worker to not being a worker. It includes a whole variety of issues. Yes, some smaller and straightforward transitions. But retirement is not necessarily the happy, stress-free time of life that popular culture says it is. I'm going to spend one class talking about LGBTQ plus workers and the special issues and concerns they have. Maybe it's just me, but popular perception seems to be that since same-sex marriage is legal, that any and all issues of concern have been eliminated, and that's not the case. And we'll talk about stereotypes of older workers, how that affects the older workers themselves, expectations of them, attitudes towards them, etc. So the purpose of this class was to get you thinking about how a person's age interacts with their health and is affected by their work and vice versa. These are not life activities and processes that occur in isolation, not at all. They're affected by and affect each other. And throughout the course, we'll be examining how that occurs. Not just in middle age and older, but how these effects begin to accumulate when younger. Now, make sure you read the article that was assigned for this week. These articles are not just something extra, they will be incorporated into the course.